Daniel Gross, and this is the number. The number today is 14. That is the number of days that our guest, Michael Woodford, was the CEO of the Japanese company Olympus before being unceremoniously dismissed. And in there lies a tale in his new book, Exposure, Inside the Olympic Scandal, How I Went from CEO to Whistleblower. Michael joins us today. Thanks so much for coming in.
Pleasure, Daniel.
Give us a very brief summary. You were a sort of a lifer with this company.
30 years. I'd run companies in the United States, and my last position was the president of Olympus Europe.
And Olympus is known probably to a lot of Americans as a camera company, but there's so much more than that.
It's real business. It's large business. It's money-making business. It's healthcare, and it has 70% of the endoscope business, looking inside the human body with tubes.
Right. So in April 1st, 2011, in a somewhat revolutionary act, you are named to be president of this Japanese company, which is sort of the CEO role.
Yes.
And there were only a couple other sort of foreigners who had had roles like this in corporate Japan. What greeted you at the job?
I mean, I returned to Japan just a few days after the earthquake, so other Gaijin presidents weren't in Japan, so I was greeted by my colleagues with great pride that the Gaijin, the foreigner, had come back. And those early weeks in the job were where Japan was trying to get itself back on its feet, including for Olympus, its factories. So those were very special weeks where I saw the very best of the Japanese people. But I got on very quickly with my task of putting in new management across the world, cutting our costs. And by the summer, the share price was rising very quickly as the financial community saw that the Gaijin would close things which didn't make money and would invest in those businesses which were needing capital.
At which point a bomb sort of explodes in the form of some investigative journalism pieces that show the company had spent what amount to billions of dollars on acquisitions of a face cream company, a microwave plate manufacturer, firms that had really nothing to do with Olympus's.
We bought three companies for $1 billion, and nonsense, Mickey Mouse companies, face cream, plastic plates for microwave, and a disposal.
Without adequate disclosure to shareholders.
Exactly.
And what about internally? So you're sitting there in the boardroom. Did these, you hadn't heard of them?
Anyone looking at the accounts, investors such as Southeastern Asset Management here in the States, or Harris Associates, big value investors, big holders in Olympus, no one knew.
And so what was the response when you saw this and asked for an explanation?
I mean, it got scary because Factor, the magazine which originally made these revelations, said there were links to antisocial forces, which meant the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia. The New York Times also published an alleged leaked memo between the New York, the police in Japan and the prosecutors in Japan. And I was scared and petrified. I thought people were going to hurt me and my family. So I had begged and pleaded with my board colleagues that we should call in investigators, forensic accountants, but they fired me, and fired me in a way which was atypically Japanese, brutal, harsh, humiliating.
And what this really is kind of a window into the way corporate Japan works, this sense that by raising these questions and demanding an answer, you were somehow being disloyal. These were sort of shenanigans on a very large scale at a publicly held company where all these people had fiduciary duties to public investors to sort of ride herd and make sure that assets were not being squandered in this way.
If this was happening on the Dow or the FTSE in London, I mean, it is a real Alice in Wonderland. A month after I was dismissed, the share price had fallen 81.5%. $7 billion had been struck off the value of Olympus, yet the institutional Japanese shareholders would not speak one word of criticism of the incumbent board or utter one word of support for me. The fired president who was going through purgatory trying to tell the world about this $2 billion fraud. If you want to know what's wrong with the capital markets in Japan, just look at the behavior of the Japanese institutional investors. It is utterly bizarre.
Now, frequently when something like this happens at a British or a European or an American company, there's some sort of whistleblower internal, and there's frequently a sort of paper trail where they are raising concerns to people above them, and then the responsible party is somehow telling them not to make a noise. But Olympus didn't have sort of internal mechanisms to deal with these sorts of issues or complaints.
I mean, they had an internal whistleblower line, but that would have just gone up to the board where all the bad guys are. But, Newsweek and the Daily Beast, you know, you're an organization which is looking and probing and questioning and cynical of powerful people and powerful forces. In Japan, the whistleblower did go to a magazine, they'd published, but mainline media remained silent. They will not attack powerful corporations like Olympus. That's really worrying. The media is self-censoring.
And the upshot was that the company had purchased these other firms at a very overvalued price. They were sort of owned by parties that had connections to bankers and people who were associated with the company?
I mean, in my book, I explain it in very, very simple terms. But it's not just fraud, it's just this extraordinary tale of human behaviors which would be unbelievable to most people in the West, the way they went about it. I mean, if you were going to commit a fraud, Daniel, and you're a high-tech medical company, would you set up a plastic plate company for microwaves and a face cream company? Would you?
Probably not.
It's utterly crazy.
Again, so the book is very dramatic. It details sort of fears for your and your family's physical safety.
My wife nearly had a nervous breakdown. Our marriage nearly came to an end, and you know, couldn't sleep, drinking large amounts of alcohol just to turn one's mind off.
And rather than sort of shrink from this, you sort of went back and tried to gather shareholders to replace the management, and you kept on going back to Japan, even in the face of what you had seen. Why?
You know, people who say they love their company, I always find that word an exaggerated term of the word love, but I did love the people I'd worked with for so many years, and I had a 4-year contract. You know, I knew I'd be okay, but if I went back, the contract wouldn't be paid out. But I wanted to go back. It was such a good company with people I'd known, really cared for, and I didn't want to just leave them. But I had a new slate of directors, all Japanese, some of the very best businessmen in Japan. But our problem was those same Japanese institutional shareholders who wouldn't criticize the incumbent board would never support me. The last thing they wanted was somebody like me going back with forensic accountants and exploring all the links. So it was never to be.
And so what does this tell us about Japan? You know, just a generation ago, Americans were petrified that Japanese companies were taking over the world. They were so aggressive, they were so efficient, they had it figured out better than we did, and they were buying our assets, and Japan Inc. was the next great thing. And of course, we've seen the last 20 years, you know, their bubble pop, they've never been really able to get out of it. When you go there today, you know, their population is declining. It seems like a nation in decline. And their institutions really seem incapable of adapting to this new environment. Is that the tale of Olympus? Is that the takeaway?
It is. I mean, Olympus is just a window on Japan. Not that all Japan is fraudulent, but the dysfunctionality, the inability to face up to realities. You know, the denial goes on throughout corporate Japan. So the consumer electronic companies like Sharp, Sony, Panasonic, they've all got junk status. You know, America's bought Facebook, Google,
right.
Apple in consumer electronics, Samsung in Korea. You know, they are losing the plot, and it's not a meritocracy. The best people don't get to the most important positions. If you want creative destruction, then you're going to have the mavericks, the young, the odd women. They don't. They follow in this super conservative, age-based system, and it's dying. I mean, Japan is sleepwalking to oblivion.
Right. Okay, well, Michael Woodford's book, Exposure Inside the Olympus Scandal, How I Went from CEO to Whistleblower, really gives us a window into that. If you send an email to business@newsweekdailybeast.com, we will put you in a drawing for a free copy of this book, which I highly recommend. I'm Daniel Gross, and this is The Number.